Good, man. You're looking good.
Hanging in there.
Yeah, good. Um, well, thanks for coming back, man. I appreciate it. Last time I talked to you, I don't think we had video, did we? I think we were just on the
No, yeah,
phone.
actually, I haven't been using Instagram as much, so I was thinking we were going to do it off the phone, and like I have Instagram where I have to search for it, and so your message didn't pop up, hence
Oh,
my
shoot. Okay.
being a little late to join there, but
It's all good. We
yeah,
made it happen.
on video. All right.
Cool. Um, what's good, man? Are you training? Are you running? What's up?
So yeah, I'm in a pretty drastically different place than the last time we talked.
Yeah.
I have been dealing with what I would call proper overtraining syndrome for the last 6.5 months or so.
Oh, that
As I
sucks.
finished Javelina, it just the lights kind of went out, and it's been quite the journey. It's been its own test of endurance. Still
So,
still waiting my way through it.
okay. I imagine that there's a big question mark on that. Like, what exactly is going wrong, and what do I do? But let's back up, man. I haven't talked to you since Javelina. So, how did the training go? How did the race go? And what happened afterwards?
Yeah, so the last time I talked to you was shortly after Nolan's, and
Yeah.
I was riding that high, and I was riding that high. But to be honest, this definitely started uh, showing its ugly head a little bit post Nolan's. The longer events I've done in the past have certainly been fatigued after, but I hadn't had any real, we'll say, mental health issues. I didn't have any brain issues,
Hmm.
and pro in the weeks following Nolan's, probably for when I was talking to you, is shortly after, still feeling good. Body was still trying to figure out if I was going to demand more of it or not. But probably about 2 weeks after until 4 weeks after, I definitely had some pretty intense depression and increased desires to drink alcohol,
Hmm.
and was really struggling. It was a pretty prolonged recovery for me.
Hmm.
And but then after around 4 or 5 weeks, things started to kind of feel good, and I was able to get back into training. And now looking back, hindsight 2020, foolishly decided to do Javelina because I was signed up for CCC, but if I did Javelina, I could do UTMB. So decided with I don't know, a couple weeks notice to do Javelina. I've been running a bit, and workouts were okay, a little slower than normal, and I certainly didn't have as much energy and stoke behind my running as I usually do. That's something
Sure.
that's a bit nebulous and hard to pin down. I think the stories we tell ourselves about our training can often be kind of defense mechanisms to,
Totally.
generally getting out the door and training more always works out, and just kind of wading through the muck and until you feel good again. And when you feel good again, training harder usually pays off. This time it certainly didn't for me. So I did Javelina. I had a pretty good first 40 miles, and then I just fell apart. I was certainly not used to the heat, and that was a part of it. I probably had a little mild heat stroke, just sort of fell down on the trail. And I remember it's they did a lot of waves this year,
Hmm.
so waves were going off at all different times. I think it was spread out over like 3 days, 3 or 4 days.
Hmm.
And right after, like, I kind of like passed out on the trail, I was walking, and I just remember an older gentleman, probably in his 70s, was like passing me walking. Yeah, it was a good humbling experience. So I ended up finishing, kind of running the rest of the way, but it was pretty brutal. And I was tired after a 100 miler, as you always are. Um, I will say, after the event, my legs hurt in a way they never have before.
Hmm.
Certainly could have been some sort of rhabdomyolysis. It's hard to say. It's like the creatine kinase levels are always pretty high after a 100-miler in the heat. But my legs hurt so much I couldn't sleep a wink. It was pretty excruciating, and I didn't want to take ibuprofen because I didn't want to mess up my kidneys anymore. But I didn't sleep at all after that race because my legs hurt so bad. And I think that was a little bit of a sign of things to come. So I was good for a couple of weeks, and then I took a week off and then started jogging a little bit, and that was kind of okay. Probably around 2 weeks after, I went out skinning, uphill skiing one day, and ended up bumping into my friend, John Gaston, who's a very fast skimo athlete, and going a little faster and longer than I wanted to. And man, the next day, we're talking about mental health here. I just got hit by a truck. So there was fatigue, but there was just an overwhelming, somewhat uncontrollable depression that just washed over me. And there was an intensity to it that was pretty frightening. Didn't mean to be honest. We'll just jump right in here as we did last time. There was some pretty intense suicidal ideation popping up right there. And it was, it was not fun. And that was a very, very intense night. The following day, after just that, couple hour skin that usually would be pretty normal. And the last 6 months I've pretty much followed that pattern. I've been in a better place the last couple of weeks, but I'll be honest, maybe last, I don't know, week and a half, 2 weeks. Yeah, but it's been a really wild ride. And that for me has definitely been a hallmark of my kind of overtraining experience, is that it has really, really negatively impacted my mental health. And it's been a pretty intense battle. And at this point, I'm not all that concerned with getting back to training and being the athlete that I was. I'm more concerned with just having my brain back and having my life back. That's definitely much more paramount and much more important to me at this point.
Big time. So you're attributing most of this to overtraining?
That's a good question. I wish I had some really, I wish I had a better answer to that, because a lot of this is, I'm in the middle of it. I'm not, on the other side. I think in general, we like, problem, solution, and, after story, problem, solution, success. And unfortunately, I'm in the middle, and it's murky. I don't have a clear answer as to what's going on. I think most people who are dealing with overtraining in the true sense of the word end up having some similar confusion about their affliction in the same way that I do. So for me, it is definitely presented in this, mental health kind of brain struggle, but I have physical symptoms. I've had, some hair loss, some kind of rapid hair loss that I didn't have before. And one of the more notable symptoms is water retention. So socks still leave pretty substantial indents in my calves, and I'll get a really swollen face some mornings. And there's definitely quite a bit of fluid just floating around in my body that wasn't there before. So there are some physical symptoms, but a lot of it has presented in the brain. And I am open to all ideas. I'm open to the idea that this is some deep-seated mental health issue that's finally coming to a head. I'm open to the idea that this is some sort of parasite or virus that is being brought back to the surface by stress. That's kind of the idea of what causes chronic fatigue syndrome at this point. I'm open to the idea that it could be gut health, like that there's some sort of leaky gut situation going on that causes the gut biome and thereby the neurotransmitters and the rest of the body to be out of whack. I'm really open to everything at this point, and I'm exploring a lot of stuff, but I am attributing it essentially to overtraining, and that there was very much I was essentially okay, and then I was essentially not okay.
Yeah.
And there's a pretty clear line.
That's crazy, man. That's scary. And I'm guessing that the athlete that you are, you're trying to tackle this from every single angle and direction that, I'm sure you're messing around with your diet. I'm sure you're doing everything, right? And I want to get into all that, but I wanted to have you on because I knew you were kind of struggling. Like, we've talked, I had you on the podcast before. It was a great interview. Like, everybody loved that interview, by the way. A lot of people really resonated with it. And it was one of the most downloaded episodes. So, and that's not why I had you back on, but I had you back on because I thought that you were just a fantastic guest, and you were open and you were honest. And you said that when I asked you to be on, you said, well, I'm still kind of struggling and I don't really have any answers. And I said, well, if you're open to it, perfect, man. Because, as I mentioned, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And I sort of just recently kind of came out, I guess you could say, with my mental health diagnosis and some of the struggles I've gone through in the past and what I'm up against now. And so I just wanted to chat with you and just see to see exactly what you're up against. So as far as your lifelong battle with mental health, I know you mentioned that you struggled with eating disorders in the past. Have you always struggled with mental health? Has there been moments in your life when you've been depressed or anxious, or have you had like a legit diagnosis, or so before Javelina, maybe even before Nolan's, where was your mental health?
So yeah, I would say mental health has been a pretty defining aspect of my life. So I was a pretty good kid, and then really from the time I can remember, I've struggled with depression and anxiety. It kind of came to a head early in high school for me, with addiction and depression and anxiety and suicidal behavior and stuff and all those bad things. Mm-hmm. And for me, the eating disorder was definitely a pretty big issue for me to overcome. Not that depression and addiction are easy issues to deal with, but for me, there is just less shame around those issues. And it was just with my family and with the programs that I was a part of, it was very much accepted in a way. And I just didn't really feel shame. There was just kind of a narrative around those stories that I could grasp my head around, that my parents could get around, and that my friends and extended family could understand as well. My eating disorder for me was something that was extremely private. It developed basically when I was at boarding school. I was, sent away for being troubled teen, and it developed there, likely for a variety of reasons. Certainly one of which was that I had no control over my life. I was a young kid and 15 and I had absolutely no control. And, drugs and all of that was taken away from me. I couldn't externalize my issues in the normal ways that I could. So I internalized, and I think that's essentially where the eating disorder gave birth. And it wasn't something that I dealt with for a long time.
So your eating disorder started after you said drugs were taken away from you? Is that how it went? Okay.
Yeah. I think that's probably a good way to put it. I think there's likely some kind of complex neurophysiological physiology going on there that leads certain people to develop an eating disorder. Like maybe, one of the things that's postulated is that in people that develop eating disorders have higher serotonin levels, which causes increased feelings of anxiety, and starvation decreases serotonin levels. So it's obviously complex, but it's possibly a way to deal with a neurotransmitter issue in the brain. But yeah, so it was something that came when I was in recovery from drugs and alcohol, and things were going pretty well in my life when that was raging. It's certainly something that can be a very functional disease that can coexist while the rest of your life is seemingly going well. But it is actually the most dangerous mental health disorder. It has the highest mortality rate of any of the disorders out there. It can really wreak havoc on your brain and on your body. It's pretty dangerous, and I think something that's pretty endemic in the endurance sports community, and something that's really not talked about a lot because there's so much shame around it. And I didn't really open up about it until I had told my wife and some friends and my parents. That really wasn't until later into my 20s, but I didn't really open up about it to in a public way. I did this 24-hour vertical event where I was raising money for a local mental health organization, and I just sort of opened up about it in that in the context of raising money for that effort. And the messages I got from that, people reaching out to me to kind of share their own story, was pretty powerful. The same thing happened recently when I was on a panel with a local hospital and the same mental health organization. I just had a lot of people reach out saying that it's something they've battled with, but they really just don't feel comfortable talking about because it's something that has a lot of shame attached to it. And I think the narrative kind of attached to eating disorders is something that doesn't really represent what these disorders actually are. I think that while there's still a lot of stigma around depression and addiction, I do think that some of that is starting to erode because it's talked about a lot in the media, and we have a lot of examples of successful people recovering from these disorders and going on to lead successful and fulfilling lives. I don't think that story is told as much in the context of eating disorders, and often, if it is, it's kind of phrased in this way where it's a byproduct of trying to be an amazing athlete. It's like, oh, you were amazing collegiate runner or an Olympic hopeful, and you unfortunately developed this eating disorder because you were trying to be the best. And while that certainly can be some people's story, I think often it's much more complicated than that and bears a lot more similarities to depression, anxiety, and obsessive compulsive behavior, where it's something that you don't really have control over. Once you're aware that it's a problem, you certainly have some control over it. But the fact that you develop that behavior is not necessarily anything that was your fault.
Yeah. I'm trying to wrap my head around this. I mean, I understand addiction, recovery, anxiety, depression. Those are all things I've sort of experienced, and I understand to a certain extent. An eating disorder, like from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, there's no medication to help you with something like this. And even if there is, we all have to eat. like with alcoholism, you cut out alcohol 100%. And then you try and dig into your head. Like what are the issues or the traumas from your past that make you behave in this certain fashion, but you're cutting out alcohol altogether. And with an eating disorder, you have to learn to manage this thing because we all have to eat. So I attend a 12-step group, and we've had people come in from Overeaters Anonymous, which is a little bit different, but and the old timer alcoholics look at these guys like, come on, like, what are you doing here? But really it's like their disease is probably tougher than ours because, like I said, we can just completely eliminate this and then learn to move on. And they're just learning to manage this thing. Am I coming at that the right way? Does that?
No, I mean, in a way you are. So I spent time in AA rooms, so I'm very familiar with the 12 steps. And I think one of the ways to think about it is by using the term dry drunk. So I think, a lot of people in the rooms of AA are familiar with a guy or girl that's been sober for 20 years, but might as well be drinking because they still have all the same behaviors, right?
Life is still a mess.
Changing their behaviors.
Yep.
And with eating disorders, when it comes to getting better, like, yeah, you have to eat, right? Like, and that's part of it. But very quickly you are getting to some of the root causes of the issue. So at least from my experience in my treatment, it was kind of cutting through the bullshit of like, oh, well, you just have to eat more food, to like, it wasn't phrased in this way, but to like, all right, why did you develop this? Why is this going on in your life? What's happening? And developing coping strategies around the things that drive you to this disorder. So instead of just like always phrasing like food and starvation as the issue, you're very quickly starting to address some more of the underlying issues. For me, at least, that was how I really started to improve and overcome this. I won't say overcome is probably the wrong word. It's something that you're always in recovery from. It's never too far from your mind. But there are some things you do around food, like exposure therapy, and some, for me at least, some real techniques that related to food itself. But so much of the therapy is about the things that drive you to that behavior. And I would say, with AA, like, it starts with not drinking, but very quickly it starts to become a spiritual journey and something else where you're working on a lot of the things that kind of maybe create that defect that drive you to drink. And I think that's kind of the way to think about it. I will say I've struggled with addiction and with depression and anxiety, and all of those are absolutely terrible. And my depression throughout these last 6 months have been pretty ferocious. But when I was deep in the throes of my eating disorder, in particular, when my anorexia kind of morphed into exercise bulimia, that was the most difficult period of my life. I was completely out of control. I had no control over myself. My entire life was just completely governed by that. It was something that I think it's hard to articulate because it's just food, right? It's not like you're shooting heroin into your veins or smoking crack or anything like that, but it was incredibly intense. And I had the least control over anything I've ever had in my life. And it was a pretty terrifying period. It's certainly not something fun to experience.
Yeah. So I know it's tough, and we went over some of this before, but if you wouldn't mind, just describe when you're in the throes of this thing, like what a typical day looks like, just so that I can wrap my head around it. And so the listeners can too, if
yeah,
not too hard.
Yeah, no, I can do some of that. So one thing is, you see this sometimes with in the rooms of AA and NA, and it can happen a little bit with people in recovery from eating disorders, where people try to prove that they are like the best anorexic. So I'm a little wary of doing that, but you know, it took a lot of different shapes for me. So when I was younger, when it first started, it was essentially eating as little as possible. And I think a way to kind of explain it to people who don't have a grasp around it is that in a lot of ways, eating disorders can be pretty close to psychosis, in that there's a lot of OCD behavior. So you have thoughts that are taking over your mind constantly throughout the day. You are constantly thinking about how much food you're eating, or you might have certain points of your body that you think about and are aware of. But it's a constant voice in your head that is essentially driving you to do these things. And to kind of maybe explain how serious it can be, it is in some ways parallels like more serious OCD behavior, and even some lower levels of psychosis. So that's how it was for me when it first started. When I got into cycling, so I was a competitive cyclist for quite a while, it definitely was something that was complicated, because I have a pretty rational brain, and figured out like how many calories you're burning per hour, like, and how much you could eat around that pretty quickly. And so in a lot of ways, I got better once I started bike racing, because instead of it being a game of like how little could I eat every day, it was kind of like replacing, it was like I had permission to eat because I was exercising. So in some ways it became a bit healthier. And then when I had my back injury, so my back kind of went out when I was 19, it became much more insidious, and kind of reverted back to when I was young. But I think my brain, around the time I was, I guess, 20 or so, just had enough, is kind of the way I think of it. It just couldn't deal with the constant deprivation anymore. And it very quickly went from me eating very, very little to me binging on food. And that is one of the worst feelings. And I think people in recovery from drugs and alcohol can relate to this, because the last thing you want to do is eat a lot. It's like what your whole life is about, but then you're eating like 4,000 calories in a sitting. And for me, that being an endurance athlete, the way to fix that was then go run 20 miles after. So it's probably one of the reasons why I have a pretty good stomach in ultras, as I suppose, is because I would eat 4,000 calories and go run right after. But yeah, that during that tough period of my life, it would, maybe be 2 days where I would like run 20 miles one day and 20 miles the next. And then 2 days of basically just going to school and working a little bit, and then spending the rest of the time eating and repeat. And it's really weird to say that out loud, but it certainly, that was pretty much my life. And it was something that I unfortunately think a lot of people deal with in one way or another, even if they don't identify as having an eating disorder. But that's what it was. And it was worse than when I was in the deep throes of other disorders.
Yeah. I'm thinking back to my drinking days. Like I was still I was running ultra marathons when I was in the throes of drinking and my addiction. And I guess it's sort of similar. I mean, not not as bad, I guess, but like I would drink my ass off on, say, a Friday night, and then I would get up and I would run all day Saturday to sort of sweat it out. And that was my way of being healthy, but then I would reward myself come Saturday night. Like, I did this big run today, so I'm going to drink my balls off tonight. And it would just be this constant cycle. And in my mind, I'm always thinking I'm going to quit on Monday. Like, Sunday is going to be my last day of drinking. And on Monday, I'm going to quit and I'm going to start fresh, and it was this constant cycle that just went on for years and years and years. And, so many Mondays, like hungover at work, just feeling all this shame and regret and just feeling horrible about myself. And then by the time the afternoon came around, it's like, well, nothing else going on tonight. I might as well run by the liquor store on the way home. So
there's some similarities there. It's just with eating disorders, a lot, like when you're in a binge, the binge purge cycle, which is something that a lot of people deal with. The fix to that is to not deprive yourself, actually. So by getting your brain back into the purging mindset, by whether that's, vomiting or running, or just restricting calories, the solution to not going into the binge again is to not purge. But that's a very, very, very difficult thing. So that's probably why there's a little bit of difference there. But I guess the way to think about it is the solution is to, instead of like not drinking, the solution is to try to engage with food in a normal way, which, to draw parallels to like AA and NA, it's figuring out like how to live life on life's terms, like how to integrate into the world in a normal way and feel okay about yourself. And then slowly that gets to the point where you can start to have less fear around certain foods and not use a lot of these mechanisms as tools to deal with some of the deeper emotional baggage that you have.
Why do you think there's so much shame around this? Whether it's for everyone who experiences this or for you personally? Like, I understand shame to a certain extent because, like I said, I just sort of kind of came out, at least on my podcast, with, a little bit more detail about my mental health issues. And it's hard to put into words, like, where my shame comes from. Like, I've been open with people about my addictions and letting people know that I'm certainly not a perfect. I'm totally flawed. Like, I've got all kinds of shit wrong with me, but I'm just, this podcast is to help inspire other people. But for whatever reason, I didn't want to talk about that mental health aspect. And I'm not exactly sure what the shame was really even about or is about. But can you pinpoint that at all? Like, what the shame is about eating disorders?
So I think a lot of it does kind of come back to this idea of like stories and narratives. And again, while I think there's stigma around all mental health issues, whether it's depression or alcoholism, I just don't think many stories have been told around eating disorders. And so I think we have an idea of what they are, like kind of through our cultural lens of how it's portrayed on TV and through media and how people talk about it in the aftermath. But I think because we had this view that it's, associated with vanity and trying to look a certain way or to get to a certain, goal weight or things like that, or, maybe disordered eating from being on a college team, turning into an eating disorder, that we as a culture don't really have a a clear picture of how these disorders start and how to treat them and think about them. So that's what I think it comes down to a lot, is that we have these kind of clear stories that might not all be completely true, but we have these narratives around depression, around alcoholism. And I just don't think that it necessarily exists that same way with eating disorders. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the idea of, kind of determinism in the brain, like whether we really have control over our brain or not.
Right.
And, I think recently we've kind of really swung to this idea that, no, we have a lot of control, that, if you meditate and practice mindfulness and, read these books and do these things, that you can really take control over your brain. Whereas I think before this kind of more modern mindfulness movement, we had more of this kind of wave where we were really starting to realize that a lot of these mental health disorders, and kind of accept them culturally, that they are just issues in the brain, that the brain is wired incorrectly with depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder, and that it's not anything that you did wrong, that it just kind of came to be based off of your physiology, really. Mm-hmm. And I think the reality, like a lot of things, is somewhere in the middle, that we have control and we don't have control. But I don't think that narrative has been painted much with eating disorders, where we don't have a really clear idea of the mechanisms in the brain that lead people to eating disorders. So there's maybe a little bit more fault attached to them. It's like with depression, I think a lot of us see or believe that a lot of it's kind of outside of the person's control. Whereas I think with eating disorders, we maybe don't see that. It's like, what, like just eat food, like it's okay, or just stop eating food. Like it's a control, it's a control issue. Like you can gain control of your brain over something as simple as food. But the reality, I believe, is that, it probably parallels things like depression a little bit more and addiction a little bit more, where it really is related to things going on in the brain, and that, yes, you have control over it. But kind of like with running, right? Where some people are born with the physiology to run a 13-minute 5K, and some people are born with the physiology to run an 18-minute 5K. Now, what you do with that physiology is entirely up to you. But unless you start, abusing performance-enhancing drugs, you can't really, or, find a CRISPR, like you can't really change that, right? And I think that's maybe a decent parallel for mental health issues, is that, once you realize you have a problem, your brain is wired a certain way, you can address that and take steps to kind of gain some control over it and change it. But the fact that you're there, that your brain is that way, is not something that is your fault, or that you necessarily caused. I mean, for me, my mental health issues really came at a point when I was not a fully formed human.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's like, like if I had your brain and lived your life with your traumas and the things that you went through, along with your phobias, I would probably have the same issues, and vice versa. And like, you think about these mass murderers, like Ted Bundy, like I bet you he didn't want to be a murderer, right? But his brain was wired wrong, and he turned into this horrible person, right? I'm not comparing you or us to Ted Bundy, but I mean, in the conversation of determinism, I mean, it's like, did he want to be that person? Yeah, man, it's, it's crazy to try and think about. Do you feel like, is this something you still struggle with? I know that your big struggles with this were in the past, but does your depression and anxiety still sort of stem from this? Or when you get depressed, do you go back to this place where you're still struggling with food?
Yeah, I mean, I would say my depression and anxiety started before my mental health issues started before the eating disorder.
Okay.
But it's certainly something I would say that'll, to this point, is always there.
Mm-hmm.
I've been one of the silver linings of these last 6 months, because this is the longest period I've had to take away from exercise in quite some time, is seeing that I am in a much better place with my eating disorder than I was, just, I don't know, 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not completely gone. It's maybe a little bit difficult to articulate that. But I can see that it is a lot better. Like so the last time I was, maybe in this kind of place where I am right now, where I had this injury and I just didn't know if I was ever going to get out of it and what the rest of my life was going to look like. And there was just a lot of uncertainty and certainly a lot of ego death. My relationship to food was nowhere near as healthy. So that was 8 years ago or so, I guess, 8 or 9. And my relationship with food was nowhere near as healthy as it is now. And so it's good to see that I'm not leaning on some of those disorders and bad behaviors that I have in the past. But unfortunately, maybe not unfortunately, I think what ends up happening, since I'm not kind of, getting drunk every night, or just not eating food, and I certainly can't run a lot, is that those mental health issues bubble to the surface a lot faster.
Yeah.
Because I'm not suppressing them down and not beating them back with negative behaviors. And that's good, but it can also be a little unsettling, maybe perhaps especially for my wife. So there's certainly been some really difficult moments over the past 6 months. But I suppose, again, a silver lining is that I'm not falling back into the same old behavior patterns as I have in other difficult moments in my life.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard this saying, you are your own guru, meaning like all the answers are within, right? And I think that may be so for like people without mental health problems, people who aren't sort of wired wrong, because, I've tried everything to sort of manage all of my problems on my own, meditation, breathing. I do all these crazy breathing exercises, running. I've literally tried everything, ice baths. I spent my time doing abstract art to sort of preoccupy my mind. I've done a bunch of writing, journaling, like every idea that I've ever heard. I've tried, right? And I was able to sort of get a handle on things until I went to a psychiatrist and they said, no, your brain's broken. You're probably going to be better off on medication, Do you see a psychiatrist, or do you take medication, or where are you at in the journey?
Yeah. So I've different antidepressants over the last 20 years. I haven't been taking any for, the last 8 years or so, until the last 6 months. And I have played around with different, started with like SSRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So drugs that, promote serotonin. And those certainly at this point did not help me, and were not good, and maybe exacerbated some issues. And I kind of given up on that helping me, and just kind of written it off, and then ended up trying to a less traditional antidepressant, Wellbutrin or bupropion, which works dopamine and norepinephrine. So some of the SSRIs or SSNRIs that work on serotonin and norepinephrine, but Wellbutrin's really, I think maybe Cymbalta are really the only ones that work on dopamine, and that has given me some relief. So I've thought about this quite a bit. I was talking with this one elite athlete who dealt with some overtraining issues himself, and he's a great guy, and you know, and he had his own journey, and my journey is something different. But one of the things he said to me kind of stuck with me, in that he was trying to get this figured out and was seeing a doctor, and the doctor suggested trying antidepressants. And he said, I'm not depressed, I just can't get out of bed. And I mean, there's obviously kind of some irony there, a lot of irony, in that it's like, yeah, well, depression often looks like not being able to get out of bed.
Yeah.
And that, you know, how we view depression and how we view anxiety, in a way, are just like labels, they're stories, right? And we're trying to simplify very complex issues that we don't fully understand. Like, we still don't fully understand how these antidepressant drugs work. We don't fully understand how depression or anxiety or eating disorders really work in the brain. And I think sometimes these labels can be somewhat problematic, because in the way, like you said, it's like your brain was broken. And that just might be a better way to think about it. It's like maybe part of this overtraining journey or this overtraining experience is that your brain is broken, that your neurotransmitters, through some complicated interplay in your body, got out of whack, and that you just need some medication to help your brain function better, or some therapy to help your brain function better. And it might not need to be called depression. It might not need to be called anxiety. It's just that your brain is not functioning in a normal way, and we need to try to take different steps to get the brain to function better. And I think that idea of, like, you know, maybe taking away some labels could, you know, maybe help some people, specifically some men, into finding some peace a little bit faster. So for me, so I've been taking bupropion. That's helped. I've actually been playing around with some amino acids, because they can affect neurotransmitters in specific ways. So there's one theory of overtraining, which is kind of the branch chain amino acid theory, or the tryptophan hypothesis, which is that when you exercise a lot, your brain kind of starts to be depleted of a lot of the branch chain amino acids other than tryptophan, and that tryptophan starts to kind of increase in the brain. And tryptophan is a precursor to melatonin and serotonin. So that as you start to exercise more and harder, and more intensely, that tryptophan levels and serotonin levels start to rise in the brain. And, you know, a lot of times serotonin is put forth as this, you know, miracle neurotransmitter, that it can solve a lot of your issues. But just like a lot of things, too much of it is problematic as well. And too much serotonin can be associated with eating disorders, as I mentioned, anxiety, and is even a thought that can be what causes psychosis in some ways. Some of the antipsychotics specifically kind of bind to the 5-HT receptors that serotonin binds to, so they effectively decrease serotonin. So I've been doing that. I have been working with some therapists, and I've actually, the most unique thing that I suppose I've done through this is somatic ketamine therapy.
Interesting.
Which, is definitely catches a lot of people's ears. It's certainly a new frontier.
What's that like?
Has help. It's a wild experience. I've in the past kind of always rolled my eyes at any sort of guided psychedelic experience or anything like that, because I did a lot of, you know, LSD and mushrooms in the past, and I certainly wasn't a great human being. My brain certainly wasn't functioning all that well. But the therapist that I've been working with on this, she's a master's level therapist. And, the first session, she's like, yeah, if taking these drugs on their own worked, then everyone at Burning Man would, be a saint. They'd all be be mentally healthy, which obviously is quite the case. Not saying that some people that go to Burning Man aren't amazing and, well-balanced individuals. But it's, kind of combines a somatic therapy and this idea that there's things going on in the brain apart from the conscious aspect of our brain that really end up impacting what happens in our body, what happens to the conscious aspect of our brain, and that using somatic therapy and a disassociative drug can kind of help start to address some of these issues that may be affecting the midbrain in a way that is kind of firing you up into this fight or flight response that doesn't allow the brain to calm down, which makes a lot of sense in the context of overtraining. One of the weird things that I have, and so one of my friends, Paul Hamilton, who is an elite trail runner, ski mountaineer, bike pack racer, he works 2 doors down from me and has overtraining as well. So our joke is that there's something in the water at La Fontana Plaza that causes overtraining. But we have some differences in how our overtraining has presented. But one of the similar things is that we're tired through the day. We don't necessarily feel like exercising, but then we can't sleep at night. So, like last night I was able to fall asleep around like midnight, but then I woke up at like 3:30 in the morning and get back to bed. Previous night, couldn't go to sleep until 4 in the morning. So it's kind of a weird thing where you're tired and wired. Yeah. And something is kind of gone haywire in the endocrine system, or again, something with the neurotransmitters that kind of puts you in this really odd brain state that is anything but comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So at this therapy, is this done intravenously?
So we do it, when I do it with her, it's oral, and it dissolves in the mouth. So
okay,
the brain barrier somewhat rapidly.
And so I'm just picturing, and I may be way off, but like laying on a couch with the blindfold on and a therapist there kind of talking you through this, maybe asking you questions, digging into your past, or what exactly happens?
So you kind of talk beforehand, and then actually you have an experience. So you put the blindfold on and headphones, and have an experience in the chair.
For how long?
The therapist room for around an hour.
Okay.
And then you do integration after, and it's definitely wild and a new frontier. And the therapist that I work with, Christy Nichols, she'll kind of call it woo woo at some point, like, yeah, it seems kind of like woo woo and out there, but when you start to kind of think about the brain and the different parts of the brain, it starts to make some sense. Mm-hmm. And for me, where it's really been helpful is to get out of the conscious brain a lot. I think a lot. I'm a problem solver. And during these last few months, I've thought way too much. And often the thoughts, I would say the majority of the time, the thoughts are not freaking great. Mm-hmm. And thinking my way out of these thoughts has not brought me a lot of solace. So, I'll have I end up having, unfortunately, this is the closest I've come to like really making a plan to commit suicide. I've had serious bouts of anger and anxiety and just kind of the whole gamut of mental health issues. And I'll try to, kind of perform some cognitive behavioral therapies and, tell myself like, this is not your brain's not working properly.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'll try to get into my breathing and my breath and things like that. But it didn't really bring me much relief. And for me, through this therapy, it's allowed me to kind of develop some sort of like mindfulness body cues that get me out of the brain, kind of out of the conscious thought, and kind of stop that negative feedback loop and shut down kind of the conscious aspect of the brain, calm down in a part of the body. And then that in turn allows the frontal lobe, the conscious part of the brain, to kind of relax and form a different story that isn't as problematic.
Okay. Interesting. I've heard of it. I've been interested. Have never tried it. So I just had to ask, man. What else are you?
I will say, yeah. So the other, I just turned the light on, it's getting a little dark. So the other thing with ketamine is that ketamine by itself has been shown to have like rapid antidepressant effects. And we've talked about like serotonin and dopamine. I believe a lot of, researchers are looking at ketamine and trying to kind of work backwards to figure out what exactly causes depression. Since it really shows, or it has shown in a lot of studies, that it provides rapid antidepressant effects, whereas like when it comes to Prozac and even Wellbutrin, the studies are kind of mixed. Like they often don't do much better than a placebo, whereas ketamine's a bit different. And it seems to work on the kind of the GABA glutamate system, which are also very prominent neurotransmitters in the brain. So there is likely something going on at a neurotransmitter level as well.
So do you feel better after a session with her?
Not necessarily right after, but kind of the first therapy session I had, I told my wife, Kylie, that it felt like I had just had 5 therapy sessions at once. Wow. I was completely wiped the next 2 days and like barely left the couch. I was exhausted. And I wasn't depressed or anything like that, but just completely worn out. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of, it kind of like with any therapy, I would say it's, fatiguing and exhausting, and positive all at the same time.
Yeah. What else are you doing? I would have to guess you're just throwing everything at this diet. Are you doing meditation? Are you standing on your head for 2 hours a day? Or I would have to guess you're literally trying everything, but I'm just guessing. Like what else are you getting up to?
Yeah. So I think it'll be really interesting for me to maybe listen to this conversation 6 months from now, with hopefully a clearer picture on things. Because again, I'm still in the throes of it, and I don't really know what's going to get me better other than just time.
Yeah.
So a lot of the main reason, like why I'm like been doing the ketamine therapy and antidepressant drugs, things like that, is because the only real thing I've been able to find medically wrong with me is my brain. So I've done a ton of blood work, and as is very common with people who have overtraining syndrome, nothing is really all that wrong. Like there's some numbers here and there that are a little off, but nothing that would explain some of the issues that I'm having, which is where a lot of people end up being. Jeff Rose documented his overtraining issues a decent amount. There were some pretty extensive interviews with him, and he wrote a good article for, I think, iRunFar and ultrarunning mag. And in one piece that I saw in ultrarunning magazine, he said that, for the first 6 months, the first year, he was really, really concerned with figuring out what was going on, figuring out what was causing it. And after seeing a plethora of specialists and trying everything, he was more concerned with essentially being okay with not being okay. And I would say that's kind of where I'm at. While I am still trying things and experimenting with different stuff and spending way too much time on Google Scholar, I am mostly trying to be okay with not being okay, and working on some stuff in my brain that is going on right now, but also hasn't really gotten enough attention over the last few years, and maybe pursuing some growth in some other areas. So that's, I would say, really where I'm at and what I'm thinking kind of on a deep level, while I'm hopeful that I'll figure out the magic bullet and be able to tell it to the world and write a great article for Outside Magazine. Like, all those thoughts like go through my head. I think the reality is that it's something that will take time and require a lot of personal growth for me to be able to get to the point where I'm okay with whatever the new reality is. That being said, I can list off all the things I've tried. So Corinne Malcolm wrote a really good article for Iron Far, kind of summarizing overtraining and the different hypotheses out there. And in that article and through the research I had done, it seemed like the cytokine hypothesis made a lot of sense. It was essentially, a lot of us are familiar with cytokines now from COVID, but they're inflammatory markers. So essentially that you get overproduction of cytokines, which causes inflammation throughout the system, and that they end up lodging themselves in the brain and other areas, which just causes a whole myriad of issues. And that's kind of what leads to overtraining. We don't necessarily have like a way to fix it, but that's kind of what creates it. So theoretically, what you would do there is take a lot of antioxidants, resveratrol and high doses of vitamin C, and eat a lot of vegetables and fruits, obviously, to try to knock down some of that inflammation. So I did that for quite a while. I ended up I had a very serious back spasm that lasted for like 2 weeks. It was pretty terrifying. And one of the things the doctor gave me at that time was cortisone, prednisone to try. So I ended up having like high dose prednisone for like 5 days, which theoretically would like knock down a ton of inflammation and kind of kick out some of those cytokines. And that didn't help. So that kind of, for me at least, I mean, it certainly could still be some weird pathway of inflammation that, cortisone can't get to, but that kind of kicked that. And, then kind of started with antidepressants and dealing with the neurotransmitter aspect. And, I'm still playing around with that a little bit. I think I mentioned, maybe trying to like lower levels of serotonin, and I'm somewhat hopeful with that. But we'll have to see how that works out going forward. For a while, I just really tried to consume a lot of protein because that just seemed to fit with like the water retention issue. And that, it was what it was. It's not a bad thing, but it didn't really do anything. I've played around with gut biome stuff and still kind of attacking that a little bit. The idea of leaky gut syndrome, which is where you get more permeability in your gut, which can actually happen with intense exercise. So for a variety of reasons, probably one of which is that, it can be like adaptive to endurance exercise, that your body gets better at emptying energy, kind of glucose from your gut into your bloodstream, which is great when you're running 100 miles, but not so good in daily life because you can increase the permeability, which theoretically would allow like toxins and bad things to get into the bloodstream more. So played around with that. Or there's also just the idea that your gut biome can be destroyed from intense exercise and eating too many simple carbohydrates too often, and not enough, fibrous foods and whatnot, and not enough diverse food. So I played around with that, and I'll probably keep doing that. I don't think eating healthy and consuming a lot of glutamine, which helps repair the lining of the gut tissue, is bad.
It's not going to hurt you.
I don't think any of that stuff is bad, so I'll keep doing that. But again, a lot of where I'm at and where I think the real solution will unfortunately be is probably time and just kind of, getting to a place of acceptance and just allowing my, brain and body to relax for an extended period of time.
Yeah. Yeah. My heart goes out to you, man. I mean, you're just such a freaking good athlete. And, I just feel your pain. You're just like stuck in this thing and trying to claw your way out. And, so I don't know. It's rough, man. I mean, what does, so when I get depressed, when I'm in the throes of depression, it's not like I'm thinking to myself, I'm depressed right now. I need to take care of myself. I need to be kind to myself. I need to take some time off or whatever. It's just usually manifests like I'm really tired and I'm really irritable and I don't want to talk to people and I want to isolate and be by myself. And then 3, 4, 6 days down the road, looking back, I'm like, oh, damn, I was really depressed for a couple of days there. How does it look for you? Is it similar?
Yeah, I would say on some days it's that I'm really tired and just can't get out of bed, or it's kind of all I can do to make it to work. Unfortunately for me during this period, there's been an intensity to it. So like uncontrollable crying and just real intense feelings of self-loathing overwhelming my brain. So there certainly has been a really vivid aspect to it. I mean, just to paint a picture, my wife Kylie found me on in the bathroom a couple weeks back. I don't know, maybe a couple weeks, a month back, and it was in the morning. Nothing bad had happened that day or the day before. Nothing new, but I was just bawling my eyes out, sitting on the toilet, just saying that I just wanted it to stop, that I was just tired of it. Yeah, it's been a really interesting experience from a 10,000 foot view, and that, there's just not a ton of control to it. And I'm doing what I can to develop strategies to gain a little bit more control of it, or alter my brain chemistry in a better way. But it's been that, or honestly, like there'll be times where I just get into a ridiculous angry rant, and it doesn't go well, and I'll end up driving off and just walking in the woods down the Crystal River for a while. So it's been very, very intense, which has certainly been pretty worse. And the last couple of weeks have been a little bit more promising and a little bit calmer. But my wife and family were pretty worried for me for a bit there. And, the next step was kind of checking out of life and just finding a way to kind of remove as much stress as possible and relax. But I think maybe I'm in a place where I don't have to do that, but we'll see.
Yeah, that's such a shitty place to be in. And I've been there, man. I've been there where I'm just completely out of control of the things I'm doing and the things I'm saying. And my emotions are so out of control. And suicide seems like the answer, and it's sort of hard to say that out loud because people will be listening and get the wrong idea. But I've always thought of like suicide as like an option. Like if things get so bad, I always have that, right? And I can always just take care of myself, right? And most of the time nowadays, when I think about suicide, now that I'm on antidepressants and I, have a sponsor and go to a 12-step meeting and do everything I can do to sort of manage this thing. Now, when I think about suicide, most of the time I think, not today, not today. It's not going to happen today. Like, sure, it's an option, but not today.
Yeah.
A year ago, I was in a really, really bad, dark place where, my fiance was worried about me and my health and worried about what she was going to come home to. And I was just completely out of control of my emotions. Like I'm just like yelling at people at work for no reason and just like about to lose my job and lose everything. Right. And, it's just a rough place to be in. It's like, what
Yeah.
can you do, man? It's like,
Yeah. It's really not, it's not fun. And, it's interesting because I think, voicing that, I actually believe that, voicing that we've struggled with suicidal thoughts and ideation is helpful because I think it can take away some of the stigma and make people not feel so alone and more likely to voice that to other people and to seek help in moments of crisis because you realize that it's not such a unique affliction. One of the weird things for me is I'm pretty open talking about this. I have some friends that battle mental health issues as well. And, we've been in contact over what we're going through. And I was talking to one of my friends the other day and he was like, yeah, you just seem like you're in a much better place than you've ever been. Like you're really addressing a lot of these issues and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this is the most psychotic I've been in maybe ever. And it's a weird thing to talk about it and to be aware of the things I should do and even in doing the things I should do, but to still be struggling. And it shows, I think, how difficult these disorders, these diseases are and how hard they can be to overcome and how important it is to just to have something, to go to therapy, to go to 12-step meetings, to have a, sponsor if you're in recovery, things like that. And just having people that you can talk to in your life because they do tend to be ongoing problems. It's rarely is it something that you're just like recovered from, right? Like often
right.
they're just, you're in the process of recovery. And, and I think, a lot of people can relate to that in one way or another that, life is good and it's going great. And then something just smacks you right on your ass. And you really have to adapt and grow and change and deal with new demons that come up to be able to make it through that day and get through to the other side where, where you can maybe be a more, fulfilled human that isn't just constantly battling with the demons inside their head.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you typically are you a therapy guy? Do you go to therapy and do you feel better after talking to a therapist? Because like I'm typically really introverted and I don't find that talk therapy really helps me. And I haven't given it a full shot. I've only tried a couple therapists and just haven't had luck with it. And, but I don't really know that it's for me. I think that having conversations with like this honestly helped me more than talking to a therapist who can't necessarily put themselves in my shoes. They've done all the studying and they know what to say, but they've never really been there. I think that, calling an old friend that I've known forever that I haven't talked to in 10 years is going to help me more. Having a conversation with yourself that has actually been there and understands what I'm going through helps me a little bit more. Do you go to therapy? Do you feel like it helps you? Where are you at with that?
So I've done a lot of therapy in the past, like with my eating disorder. When I first started dealing with that, I did a lot of therapy and then when I was younger. I did a lot of it. I haven't much over the last, 7 years. And that's kind of what I was saying about like one of the silver linings right now is that I'm kind of delving back into some stuff and, and dealing with some of the issues that, that have been ignored in a way. Right. So for me, it is helpful. But again, like kind of the therapy I'm currently doing, there's some talk aspect to it is helpful in part because like I'm a pretty extroverted person. Like if anything, the problem is, especially in groups, that I don't shut up enough and just talk over people, and it's a problem. But one of the things that's helpful for me right now is trying to get out of my head a little bit, to shut down some of those stories and not rely on that rational aspect of my brain to fix the irrational thoughts that come up. So this currently for me has been very helpful to develop strategies to feel better. And in the past, it has helped me as well. Like when with my eating disorder treatment, for example, there was, when I went to inpatient for drugs and alcohol when I was younger, there's certainly a group therapy aspect, and I found that helpful. But I've also found it very helpful to develop strategies that help my brain work a little bit better.
Right.
So like, for example, one of the things I remember when I was in therapy for my eating disorders, it's a very, very simple exercise, but my therapist, Malia, had me go out into the world and not say anything bad about anyone else for the following week. Like no gossip, no talking shit for like the next week until you met again. And the idea was that it's like, and it's very true, that, I am like hypercritical of other people. I love to point out where other people have flaws, like, oh yeah, cool, that's great, they're successful here, but they suck here. Yeah. And the reality is that as bad as that critic is, the critic, my inner critic, the critic that's pointed right at me, is 10 times worse.
Right.
But it's really, really hard to shut that critic down, to stop being critical of yourself. It's much easier to just stop doing it with other people. And that was a great tool for me to use to stop being so hard on myself and to stop, telling myself that that I'm a piece of shit and not deserving of love constantly. So I have really developed some strong tools in therapy, and I think it can be very helpful. I think, if you're doing a 12-step program or you're doing AA, it is like therapy of a sort. Like you're going through a process and like developing tools in a way to deal with your disease, to deal with the disorder that you're struggling with. And I think it's, no matter where it comes from, I do think it's important to kind of acknowledge that the way your brain has been working, what you have been doing, brought you to a breaking point, brought you to a point where you no longer like had or have control over your life, and that something has to change. And probably the only way it's going to change is by making, behavioral changes and addressing some of the deeper issues that plague you and brought you to where you are.
Yeah, like DBT therapy, having a plan in place and using it when you need it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's heavy, man. It's heavy.
Yeah.
God, I feel for you. And I wish there was something I could do or say to make you feel better, because like I said, you're such a good athlete and there's so much talent, like just raw talent there. And you've got such a great smile. And just like when I see pictures of you smiling, it like makes me happy. Your smile, I can tell, lights up a room. And so seeing you smile is it makes other people happy, and, but I know you're in it, man. How has this affected, your family life? How is this been really rough on your wife? Is she just an angel that understands really well, or where's that at?
We have a very open relationship and have certainly, we're very, very close. We talk about the inner workings of our relationship and what's going on in our brain pretty often. But I'd be lying if I said it hasn't been really hard for her and very difficult. Her business is taking off. She's a dietitian and has her own business that really started accelerating over the last 6 months, over the last 9 months when this really started for me. And so that's been tough because she's been working a lot and stressed with that and trying to get systems into place where she can manage her client load. And, then she has a husband that's falling apart and is looking for help. So it is certainly not been easy. And I think, that's something important to recognize with all these mental health disorders, is that while it's really, really hard for the person dealing with it, it can be equally as hard for the loved ones. And that's certainly something that I've seen and I try to be aware of. It's obviously something that's difficult to do when you're in the throes of it.
Mm-hmm.
She actually just sprained her ankle pretty bad. So she's in a boot right now up to her knee and can't run for the next couple of weeks. She's had a really rough go herself of injuries over the last couple of years. She was a great athlete, great athlete, ran D1 in college and unfortunately had a pretty serious foot surgery several years back. And it's been a real battle for her with injuries ever since. So it's certainly something she can relate to, just in kind of a different way.
Yeah. But she's a normie, I'm guessing. Like she doesn't have mental health issues, addiction issues, anything like that.
Yeah, I would say she's pretty normal, but she's very intense. So we do have that in common.
Okay.
Like she just puts her all into everything, whether it's running or work. We met when I was working at Boulder Running Company, and there were, some girlfriends or boyfriends that would hang around, and often the manager at the time, Amanda, would just tell him to get the hell out. Like, hey, Andy's got to get back to work. Get out of here. But with Kylie, she just couldn't help but start working when she was hanging around. So she got offered a marketing job by just hanging around and by who she is, because I can just see her work ethic. So she can, relate with some perfectionism and intensity, and how that can lead to some problematic behaviors in people's lives.
Yeah. Are you able to exercise at all? Are you able to do anything?
So I can. I actually had a decent run before the podcast.
Okay. Nice.
So I have some days where I feel pretty good, and if anything, maybe a little manic. And then I have days where I feel pretty terrible and can't get out of bed. And it might be 3 good days or kind of a good week, and then I won't be able to do anything for 4 or 5 days. I don't push it now. When this first happened, it's I'm as endurance athletes, we become very accustomed to going out and training, even if you don't feel great. Oh, you're a little sick, you're going to go run anyways. Oh, you're a little tired, still, you're going to go skin. You just maybe do a little less or do a little less intensity and listen to your body. But in a lot of ways, push past the signals that your brain is giving you. And for me, when there's a question if I feel like running, I don't run, or I don't ski. And so that's kind of been something that has helped me a lot and got me to a place where my brain and body are a little less up and down, is that if I'm tired, I don't push it. I think that's, while I I'm not through this. I don't have a clear answer of what got me here or how to get out of it. And I don't want to be like the expert on how to not overtrain yourself. I will say that I think the best weapon we have is listening to our bodies and our brains. I think that is a phrase that gets thrown out a lot. And I think often it's bullshit. I think people are like, oh yeah, I'm running 100 miles a week, but I'm just listening to my body. And if it feels like taking a break, I take a break. And unfortunately, again, I think a lot of it just kind of comes back to the stories that we're telling ourselves. And we have in our head that we should run a certain amount, do a certain amount of hours a week, a certain amount of intensity, et cetera, and that we then form stories around that and push ourselves to places that we otherwise wouldn't. And obviously we have to push ourselves to get to the place where a body can adapt. But I think really tuning in to the signals that it's giving you and, paying attention through training logs or, if you use Strava or Training Peaks, things like that, where you can really see if you're actually progressing or not, can be very, very helpful in cueing into some warning signs that you're headed for trouble. If you're training hard and putting in the miles and still taking some rest days, rest weeks here and there, but you're not getting faster, getting slower on some of your workouts, or maybe you're doing some test efforts and things like that, some time trials, I think that can be a real clear sign that you might be headed for some danger. There's obviously the saying that it's better to be, 10% undertrained than 1% overtrained. I think that's very true, but it's a very scary place to be for people with perfectionist tendencies. And I think that idea of perfectionism is something that can also be a cue and a good warning sign. Something that makes you a lot more susceptible to developing overtraining syndrome. Alex Hutchinson just posted a study on this on Outside Magazine on how rates of perfectionism are highly correlated with developing overtraining syndrome. And thought there that it's not maybe so much like the actual miles you're running that are in the hours you're doing that is really, really correlated with overtraining syndrome. Rather, it's probably like a whole life picture. And if you're a perfectionist, it means that you are trying to be great in your relationships, in your work life, in your running life, and all of that together, kind of creates this concoction of stress that ultimately can lead to a place where your body just and your brain just fall apart.
Yeah. It's scary. It's scary, man. Gosh. How do you feel? Do we have anything else to cover?
No, I feel pretty good. I guess, one note on eating disorders, since we touched on that quite a bit, and it's something that doesn't get talked, a lot about. I will say that, there's a lot of diet wars out there, whether it's, the keto diet or vegan or vegetarian. And obviously, hammer season nail, this is a problem that I see. I really do think that an issue for a lot of athletes and something that's endemic in the sport is underfueling. And whether that's from disordered eating or eating disorders, not eating enough, I think so often that is the problem, and it's a thing that I think needs to be discussed whenever we're talking about diet. It doesn't mean that I don't think keto diet, high fat, low carb can't be helpful in ultra marathon distances, particularly, or that there aren't some arguments for vegan and vegetarian diet. I can see kind of all the different sides there, and I don't really care too much what people do, and don't have really strong feelings that way. But I do have some pretty strong feelings about preaching to all athletes, especially young athletes and young athletes that have a lot of drive, perfectionist tendencies, that eating enough and fueling your body for performance is likely going to give you more performance benefit than anything else, and save you from some of the pitfalls of, red S and some of the other injuries that can be born out of underfueling.
So like underfueling on the day-to-day, or underfueling during racing or training, or what exactly do you mean?
So I would say, on the day-to-day and in the larger picture, right?
Okay.
So the body can probably deal with being in a caloric deficit for a decent period of time. But if you extend that over months, years, you really start to see some problems develop. I mean,
Okay.
underfueling is really associated with developing overtraining syndrome, for example, and really associated with, developing injuries of all sorts, and, burnout from the sport, et cetera, et cetera. So I think while the general populace, probably consumes too many calories in general, and that's a problem in our society, I think very often when you're looking at athletes who are putting in a lot of hours, the problem is, not consuming enough calories, not consuming enough of the appropriate calories, whether that's, protein or getting enough, fiber and nutrients from fruits and vegetables. And I think that is something that you really, really see in a lot of collegiate programs. I think you see it a lot in the cycling world. And I think you see it beyond that with some of diet culture seeping its way into the sports performance world. So I think that that's something that kind of always needs to be considered when we're talking about, food and diet and how that relates to performance. Not that every single article written about diet or food needs to be about eating disorders. I don't think that's the case at all. But I think you need to keep in mind that a lot of athletes are very, very driven people. And if you tell them that, losing a couple pounds will get them X amount faster, that some people will very much take that the wrong way and take that to its extreme. And it can create some, performance and or mental health issues in the long run.
Yeah. What would you say to those people that may be struggling, or that may be in that right now, or that may be, struggling with their diet, with eating too little, too much, addictions? Do you have any advice for the folks out there?
When it comes to addictions and mental health issues, I really do think that, the most important thing is to get help, to ask for help, whether that is starting with a family member, a loved one, or, a therapist, or a 12-step group. I think that reaching out and finding help is incredibly important. Unfortunately, these things are typically not things that you can think your way out of. You kind of need help to think your way and kind of get your way out of that. When it comes to diet and food and things like that, I think, getting help from a professional like my wife is very helpful. And, to put it simply, it's, generally you don't want to be in more than a 250, max 500 calorie deficit a day. And if you start doing the math, if you're, running a decent amount and, on your feet throughout the day and have a decent base metabolic rate, that can come out to a decent number of, and just making sure that you're meeting those needs, not going the other direction and playing the game of how few calories can you eat in a day and how lean can you get, and not thinking that getting lean in and of itself is going to get you faster. I mean, for me, I know that really elite athletes talk about their diet and how they approach food. So I was talking with a friend a couple months back who is a really, really good endurance athlete, like one of the better endurance athletes in the country, really. And we were kind of talking about this and how, like, yeah, it's important to eat enough food, but yeah, you really also have to worry about like losing weight and power to weight really matters. This is kind of coming out of his mouth. And I'm saying, yeah, but unfortunately that can really go the wrong way, pretty quickly. And people can just take that to its extreme. We were kind of arguing back and forth on this. And at one point I was saying how, my wife Kylie really suggests that people never go more than a 500 calorie deficit, and typically not much more than 250 to 300 calories in a day. And this guy was like, yeah, oh yeah, I would never do more than that. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. Like, this is what I need to hear. Like, he's still eating, 3,500, 4,000 calories a day. He's just not eating 5,000. And that it sounds silly, but when I was, in the throes of it, I should have been eating 4,000 calories a day. And I was eating, I don't know, 1,500 too. I was going out to dinner with, cycling pros who, had done well in the Tour de France the previous year, and they would order one roll of sushi after a 5-hour ride. And that was my template. That's what I saw. So I think seeing and hearing high level athletes talk about how they actually approach food and how much food they actually eat can be a very, very helpful tool. Because I think often it can be phrased as, yeah, you need to eat enough food. That's great. But actually, if you want to be fast, you kind of got to starve yourself. I think that sentiment can still exist in certain pockets of the sport. And I think it's important to realize that a lot of the top level athletes are actually making sure that they consume enough calories and are kind of dialed in that regard.
Yeah. You're so good at this, Sean. Like, I feel like you have such an opportunity to help people, whether it's through whatever avenue, writing or counseling people who have the same struggles as you, or whatever that looks like for you. I mean, it could go a million different ways, but like, I'm sort of new to the talking about my mental health, my addictions. It's only come up with me over the last couple of years, and you're so articulate with this stuff, and you're so good at this, man. So like, I really am pulling for you, man. I want you to come through this and come out the other end and use this as a way to help people through whatever way that is for you, and it could be different for everybody. Maybe you'll be putting on seminars, maybe you write a book, maybe whatever, but I'm really pulling for you, man. And it's like the people who struggle the most are the most special people. And I feel like you definitely fit into that category, man. Like, I feel like you just have a ton to offer. So, yeah, so that's my non-articulate way to say, like that's like my bro hug. Like, it's like, dude, I wish I could say something or give you a magic pill just to make you feel better, but I know that's not going to happen. And I could tell you, call me if you're struggling, but that's probably not going to happen either if you're anything like me anyways. But dude, I'm pulling for you, and I want you to get healthy one way or another, and just hang in there, and you're not alone, and you have a lot of potential, man, and you're one of the special ones. So just hang on, man, and like, let's get through this thing together. Like, I don't know what else to say. Like I said, that's my non-articulate way of saying it. So I
think that's perfectly articulate. Okay. I appreciate you saying that. I certainly don't feel that way about myself, but I'm happy to share my story if it helps one person out there. I'll certainly put my thoughts to paper at some point, maybe when I come through the other side and things are a little bit more clear to me. But I really appreciate you saying that, and I appreciate you giving me the platform. And I think it's awesome that you're coming out with your own mental health struggles and using that to help others and show them that they're not alone. And I think it, helps you connect with people like me. And I think that, shining light on issues is a great way to take away their power and to find yourself to the other side a little bit faster. I think, in the dark, they can really fester. So
shining
awesome.
light on something to take away its power. It sounds like that's what needs to be done with eating disorders, right? Because there's so much shame around it and people aren't talking about it, like you said, like they are about other issues. So it's like, the more you talk about it, the stigmas will hopefully go away eventually. So, I mean, keep getting your story out there, man, because it inspires people. It helps people. People are listening. So, yeah, man, that's it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Adam.
Cool, brother. Well, thank you so much for coming on again. I appreciate it so much. And it's always an inspiration. So, hang in there, buddy. And, we're all pulling for you. And, I can't wait to meet you in person. I feel like we know each other. I know, dude. I'm going to come out and, dude, I know. You might know this. We just built out a van recently. So we're going to be touring around. We're mostly staying in Colorado, but we'll be over your way sometime soon. So I may be knocking on your door. Maybe we can do something fun. So
come by the door or come by the shop.
Absolutely. We'll do. Cool.
Sounds great.
Cool, brother. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
All right. Appreciate it.